Hi, political geographers. This is Dr. Devine, joined by 11 political geography students at this point. We're just kicking off our discussion, our office hours that are concentrated on your racial segregation paper. So let me just ask a couple of the students who are in attendance, what would be the most useful thing to do with the next hour and 15 minutes? Do you want me to give an overview of the paper, or do you want to just jump right into questions that you have?
I think that an overview would be helpful.
Okay. Other thoughts? How many of you have started?
I've got a good page out of it.
Okay.
That's just the beginning.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I started the first part. I haven't really gone into the actual analysis.
Right. Yeah, and that's what you're bringing up is, you know, there's actually 2 out of 3 parts. They're not equally weighted, not the same length, but 2 out of the 3 parts to the paper you can already start drafting without even doing any research at all. Okay. So what I'll do is I'll probably talk about the overview of the assignment and remind you of some resources that you may not be aware of. And then we'll do Q&A. Does that sound all right?
Sounds good.
Yep.
Okay. And you can always stop me and ask questions at any time. So even though I'm going to give an overview, just chime in and ask me a question if I'm touching on something that you need more information about. All right. So let's see. I'm going to go to my screen share here. And I'm going to go back to our track site. So here we are. You're logging onto our track site. Under resources, this is what resources looks like when you first open it. You have census data, which might be useful for you. We'll talk a little bit more about data and resources. But the first place you go here is this prompts and rubrics. And then under racial segregation analysis, you can open up this folder and see the prompt, which is the assignment, right? Has everybody got this so far?
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're just, how many people? We're 13 right now, so let's take advantage of our small size and chime in. Okay, so you're gonna be writing a paper that's 8 to 10, I say 8 to 9 here, but 10 is fine. Any more than 10, you're going too long, really. But an 8 to 10 page double-spaced paper, that's a racial segregation of your hometown. And of course, you're using this dot map to do the work. Let's see if this link actually works. It worked. Lovely. Okay, so now I have it up here twice. I don't need it. So the idea is that you go to your hometown. Are you guys seeing my screen okay? Or is the bandwidth not sufficient?
Working for me.
It's fine.
It looks okay.
See ya.
All right. Great. Okay. So you're using this map, and I would go to your hometown and just right away, you know, do a screenshot or take an image of the place that you're going to be working with. Okay. Another thing that I would encourage you to do is to follow this link to this Smithsonian article that talks about the map. And it gives you sort of an idea. Here they're looking at the example of Houston. That's Houston. Look at how Houston is segregated. Isn't it crazy? People talk about Houston being one of the most diverse cities in the country. It's also one of the most racially segregated cities in the country. So take a look at that and sort of look at how that short article is talking about the map in relationship to Houston. All right. So your paper is going to be structured in 3 parts. I do not want you to label them number 1, 2, and 3, but I want you to move and structure the paper in this way. So the first thing you're going to do is write 200 words, a couple of paragraphs. about your personal connection to this place. Okay, you can start that already. If you haven't done that, I would say start writing before you even get to point 3. Draft sections number 1 and number 2 before you get to part 3. Number 2, describe the racial landscape that you see. What are some of the racial spatial patterns that you identify? Identify at least 3. So then you've got a second component, component number 2, where you're going to analyze the racial landscape. And I'm going to take you to Yakima, Washington, my hometown. Oh my gosh, it's totally obvious how white West Valley is and Terrace Heights. Okay, so what are some of the racial patterns that I want to identify? Well, I've already said there's a concentration of white folks in the area that's known as West Valley. I know from history this is 16th Avenue. Then I'm going to say sort of east of 16th, there's a mixture of Hispanic and Latinos, and then Terrace Heights being white again. And I probably, given the fact that this community is named after the Yakima Native tribe, another spatial pattern that I would identify is the absence of Native Americans altogether. So when you're thinking about the spatial patterns, you can also be talking about what the map doesn't show. And for several of us, the histories of Native American dispossession are also really important histories. Okay, so, and then number 3, what are the 3 key moments in the town's history that have created the racial landscape that you describe? Okay, so what you see here is that I've given you sort of an allocation of words so that you understand how much real estate in the paper you want to allocate to these different sections. And section number 3 is the heart and soul of this paper. And let me just refer you back here to take a look at the rubric, how these are going to be graded. And you'll see, does the paper have a title? Does the paper have the map? Does the paper address the personal connection to place? This paper is out of 50 points total. Only 5 points goes to describing your personal connection. Okay, and then you get 10 points out of 50 for describing 3 racial patterns. But you will see that you have 18 out of 50 talking about the racial dynamics, the history, the historical factors that you identify as producing that landscape. So the reason I'm showing this to you is that you'll see how you're going to be scored, and it also reminds you that you actually have a lot of weight writing on the fact, you know, whether or not it's properly referenced in the text and the work cited. And then, you know, is the paper polished? Few grammatical errors. And then we have a category of sophistication of analysis. Which is kind of the it factor of the paper. You know, how does the paper come together? What is the, you know, the strength of the argument? How well is it written, etc. So let me pause here now that I've shown you where the rubric is and the prompt. Any questions so far?
Not here.
Okay. The trick to doing well on this paper is to identify those 3 racial dynamics, those 3 historical dynamics. I would identify the dispossession, I wouldn't say the dispossession of the Native Americans, I would say the 1848 treaty between Native Americans and Governor Isaac Stevens in Washington as one of my key moments. And I would use that 1848 treaty then to talk about the Native American history of my hometown, how it got the name Yakima, the town, despite the fact that the Yakima no longer live there. And I would organize all of my details about Native Americans and their removal from the landscape on that historical dynamic of 1848, the treaty. The second historical dynamic that I would identify would be the Bracero program from 1942 to 1964. And now many places could say that the Bracero program changes the racial landscape. Here in Texas, it's all about the Mexican Revolution. A lot of Mexicans came to this area fleeing the Mexican Revolution. And of course, this was Mexico until 1848. So, you know, those are some moments for you to be thinking about Native American, or excuse me, Mexican presence in communities and their location in the landscape. But for me, it's the Bracero program. And so when I identify dynamic number 2, I can think about, you know, what are all the different ways that I talk about the Bracero program. And that's when I would bring in this research that I've done that illustrates that labor recruiters went to Michoacan, Mexico in particular. And so that would be my second dynamic. And the third one, I'm not sure off the top of my head, to be honest. But the idea here, folks, is that when you're drafting this paper, you can already start drafting number 1, number 2. You've got maybe a couple paragraphs for number 1, maybe a page and a half you're going to use to talk about the racial landscape. And I want you to get nitty gritty. Talk to me about the names of the streets. You know, I really want to feel myself being walked through the lived spaces of that community, right? And then you get to number 3 and you say, to explain the racial landscape I have just described, I argue that dynamic X, Y, and Z are critical to understand. So you need, I'm going to emphasize this here for you, you will write the answer to this question as a thesis statement. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So by thesis statement, I mean that you're going to identify the 3 factors, and then you're going to use those 3 factors to structure the rest of the paper. You've got 2 to 2.5 pages on the Treaty of I think it's actually 1855 or it's 1845, somewhere around there. Same time period as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But you organize 2 papers talking about Native American removal. You've got 2 pages, 2.5 pages to talk about the Bracero program, and then 2 to 2.5 pages to talk about whatever my third dynamic would have been. And you're going to be thinking, gosh, there are so many things. How do I organize this paper? The trick is to find a way to take all of those details and organize them into your structure of 3 main dynamics. So for those of you who are just getting started, when is this paper due?
April 26th.
26.
The 26th. You know, what I would do is I would have, you know, an outline as you continue to do your research on the 3 dynamics. You know, I would have an outline. Dynamic number 1, it's the, what is the treaty? The 1855 treaty, reservation system created. And then my second one is the Bracero program. What's going to be my third one? Oh, the Homestead Act. I'm probably going to go like this. Let's put a Homestead Act of 1880s, let's say. Okay. For many of you in the South, I can't remember who was asking me about Tyler, Texas. Is anybody here? We're doing work on Tyler. No? Okay. You know, for many of you, actually, the Brown versus Board of Education and the integration of schools, particularly in places like big cities, that really shook things up. That might be a historical dynamic for you, because what happened was when schools were integrated, a lot of white folks didn't want to integrate, and that is what really fueled white flight to the suburbs. And sometimes there were even tricky things that were done, like creating entire new school districts along with those subdivisions to ensure that white folks were going to, you know, schools with only white kids. So you might want to be considering Brown versus Board of Education, or some controversy over like the anybody doing Mansfield? Mansfield, Texas was like the last integrated school district in the country, something crazy. And that happened long after 54. like in the 60s. So if you've got the school districts and you're wanting to bring in the school district, oh, well, here's the white folks and here's this nice high school, here's the communities of color, here's the underprivileged school, you might be thinking about this battle over integration in your community as shaping that racial landscape, okay? But what I'm getting at here, folks, and I don't think you can't see my little thing that I'm drawing here, but you draw up your, hold on, I'm gonna screen share again. I want you to see this. You have your three dynamics and then all the things that you want to say about each of them, okay? You've got about 2 pages for each of those dynamics. Okay, because of some feedback noise, I just muted everybody, so you need to unmute yourself before you want to talk, all right? So sorry about that, but gets a little bit crazy when we have lots of folks. So the key to doing really well on this paper is to think about the structure of the 3 dynamics and making sure that you walk me, your reader, very carefully through these 3 dynamics. After 2 pages of talking about the treaty reservation created in Washington State, you say, now, the second factor that you have to understand that interacts with the first is the Homestead Act and the westward colonization of Washington State by primarily Irish immigrants in the 1880s, okay? And then, because that's when my family came to the Yakima Valley, homesteaders, they were Irish immigrants, I can draw on my own experiences. I want you to draw on your personal experience and what your grandparents tell you. You are encouraged to be writing in the first person, okay? This is an essay that's very much first person written. You can draw on interviews that you have with your aunts or your uncles or maybe some older folks in the community who know this history. That's a great way to get information for your paper. All right, let me just pause and allow folks to ask questions at this point before we maybe talk about how you do get resources for your paper.
I joined a little late, so I might have missed something. Do we have, for our 3 points, do they have to be like a treaty or a program or an act, or can it just really be like anything that's happened?
Is that Jacqueline?
Yes.
No, it can be anything. It can be anything. Thank you for your question, okay? It doesn't have to be a treaty. It doesn't have to be an act. But one thing that you want to be keeping in mind is that the more precise you can be about the historical factor, the stronger the paper. So rather than just saying, you know, one of my factors is racial segregation in the Jim Crow era, let's pretend that you're talking about Austin. Rather than saying that one of my dynamics is racial segregation in the Jim Crow era, no, get really specific and say the 1928 Coach and Fuller Plan that created the Negro District, the 1935 Homeowners Loan Corporation redlining program and mortgage lending practices, right? So you can choose anything you want, but the more specific your 3 dynamics are, the stronger the paper. Because if you were just to say a history of racial segregation and, you know, the Bracero program, to use any city pretty much could claim that. So you want to be a little bit more specific if you can.
Thank you.
Good question. What other questions do people have?
Hi, this is Evan.
Hi,
So I'm doing Austin, and I'm definitely gonna talk about the 1928 plan and the 1935 HOLC
Redlining.
redlining maps.
Yeah.
And I'm still kind of figuring out what I want my like third historical factor moment to be. But within those factors, I want to talk about school segregation, income segregation, and housing segregation. Like, should I focus only on one of those, or can I like include that like into?
Now this is a good dynamic. So, okay, this is a good example. So you definitely want your 3 historical factors to be like the 1928 plan, like the 1935 HOLC redlining, then organizing your paper saying, you know, racial segregation, economic segregation, like you want to, your story is empirical. It's historical, right? Rather than talking, and you, within each of those sections, you can talk about how actually racial segregation led to class segregation, right? Because of how the growth of the suburbs worked and the disinvestment in places like the so-called Negro District in Austin, right? Now with Austin, it's kind of tricky because it's a story we've done some reading about, and there's a lot of documented history about it. So if I was you to sort of think about the 3 dynamics for Austin, I would probably have, you know, if I were you, I probably would have the Coach and Fuller plan. And then after that, I would talk about how the creation of the Negro District was later then redlined, further contributing to the disinvestment and poverty of that area. But for me, I think, you know, it's also really important with Austin to be thinking about the creation of the tech industry, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I probably, so there's a lot. Like the trick is like, how do you pack all of this history under 3 dynamics? So the trick that I was doing was saying, hey, I'm going to pick 1928, the Negro District, but I'm also going to fold that history of redlining of 1935 in there. My second dynamic I might choose, and this is where you have to get the evidence, and this is your paper. There is no one right answer. You have to marshal the evidence to convince me that these 3 factors are the most important. But I think suburbanization and the creation of I-35 is another key moment. And I think I-35, the creation of I-35 in 1940 was key because it again literally cemented the divisions between East and West. But it also enabled for white flight, suburbanization, which then leads to your last factor, which is the creation of those software tech headquarters in Round Rock, etc. And then I would probably fold the history of the ongoing history of gentrification within tech coming to town as my 3rd dynamic. So if you choose as your 3rd dynamic in the 1980s, Dell and whatever, Xerox or whatever they are, major tech companies headquarter in North Austin, transforming Austin into a tech capital, right? And that would be important because to understand like gentrification today, right, you have to sort of understand tech, money coming to Austin, and how all these hipsters working for the software companies are now wanting to buy up East Austin and live in the city, right? So thanks for letting me use that example to sort of think about it. The trick for all of you is going to be, you know, how do I organize this so I can use all my information, but I don't have a laundry list of all the historical factors. It won't be an argument at that point. Now,
I actually have a question.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just had a quick question. If our paper is covering a small town of less than 3,000 people, and I've been having trouble finding information to support racial segregation, how would you suggest someone goes about finding that kind of information?
Yeah, thank you. And who was that talking? Sorry.
Dana.
Hi, Dana.
Hey.
Nice to hear your voice. I thought that was you, but I didn't see you as on my participant list.
Yeah.
That's
Sorry.
a good question. Who else feels like they're in a similar situation, that they've chosen a small town and they're having a hard time finding information about it.
I am as well.
I did it first, Dr. Divine, but I changed to Austin.
That's definitely one way to go about it. Dana, what's your city?
Dripping Springs, so it's right outside of Austin. You probably know. It's like in between Austin and Wimberley, kind of southeast of Austin.
Yeah, and when was Dripping Springs created as a community?
I think it was 1823. I think it was. I need to look again, but it was like in the early 1800s.
It's really that old. And did it get big like during suburban development and all of that during Austin? Like when did it take off?
Well, it's been taking off for probably about 10 to 15 years, but really the school districts, I think, is why people move out there. And so probably the early 1990s to early 2000s is when the population really started to expand a lot.
So I'm just looking, I always look at Wikipedia because while you can't cite Wikipedia in your paper, it is a helpful orientation. I'm not so sure about the history of Dripping Springs going back that far. But maybe you have got some information that I don't have. But let's just imagine for a moment that Dripping Springs, like you said, it gets to become really popular and populated because of the school districts. And do you think that a lot of people who live in Dripping Springs, do they commute to Austin?
Oh yeah, I would probably say a lot of them do.
Okay. So for many people who are talking about smaller communities, you can also be thinking about that community in relationship to the larger city next to it. I mean, I think that what you're saying is that you can't really understand Dripping Springs without sort of understanding Austin and Austin.
Yeah, right.
So maybe for you, sort of the mass whatever is the highway that connects Dripping Springs to Austin, it might be sort of one of your key moments, and you can talk about sort of suburbanization, I bet you that Dripping Springs, while it might have been around for a really long time, I think it probably has gotten its growth being a bedroom community, a commuter community to Austin.
Oh yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, so there's that. And, you know, in terms of other dynamics, well, I mean, I think it's a predominantly white community, isn't it, Dripping Springs?
Yeah, I think, I don't know the exact demographics, but I would say like probably 3/4 of the population is a white community.
Yeah.
So,
and it's also kind of expensive.
Yes. Yeah, it is. Very.
Yeah,
it's kind of like Lake.
You could portray Dripping Springs and its racial makeup, talking about the overwhelming presence of white folks living in Dripping Springs, is that it reflects the history of suburbanization of Austin, and also how only certain groups, namely white communities, were first allowed to participate in suburbanization and then accrued the wealth that enabled their children to buy into those homes in Dripping Springs. So there's that. Yeah, and then if we were on a one-to-one meeting, I would bring up the map of Dripping Springs and sort of look and ask questions about where people are living, like where communities of color are living in that community.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions?
I have a similar question to Dana's. This is Jacqueline again. So I'm from Kyle, so I was going to do mine about Kyle. But like you mentioned that you could kind of relate it to the city next to it. And like when I was growing up, I went to school with a lot of kids in Buda. And one of my points wanted to be like the segregation in schools. Could I like compare or use Buda and Kyle kind of as one city?
Yes, because we're thinking relationally, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we are always thinking about how places are produced in relationship to what lays outside their legal, political boundaries. So that's exactly the type of thinking that I want you to be doing, is to think, you know,
Okay, thank
about how places are produced in relationship to other places. Yeah,
You
it's
might wanna-
interesting. I mean, I'm a new person here, but I sort of get the idea that there's like a lot of people look down on Kyle who live in Buda, where it's seen as like less expensive or not quite as
Yeah.
good.
It's kind
And
of
then-
like a rivalry, but we kind
Is
of like
it? Okay, and
Yeah.
then there's like San Marcos, which is also really weird. How,
Yeah.
you know, we've talked about this in school, how when we were still meeting in person, how a lot of faculty from Texas State, they won't send their kids to the San Marcos School District.
Yeah.
And they moved to Dripping Springs
Mhm.
or Wimberley, right? Wimberley is like totally, I'm going to share my screen here.
Jacqueline, you might want to mention the rebel flag on the Jackson.
Yeah,
High
I
School.
already have that written down in my outline.
What's this?
It's they only banned the Confederate flag from being on campuses in like 2013.
Oh, interesting.
They're the Hayes Rebel. They're the Rebels, if I recall. And their
Mhm.
mascot was a rebel flag. So
Huh. Okay. So I'm just sort of catching up. I couldn't help it with the dot map. Dana, I think this is Dripping Springs.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Is that
I-
it here?
Your help.
Add map.
Sorry, I'm trying to see
Yep,
it.
Dripping Springs.
Yep.
Can you see on
Yep,
my share
that's-
screen? So what's really interesting, if you look at this map of Dripping Springs, and this is an important point, folks, it's not enough to say, oh, the creation of whatever highway this is. I don't know what highway this
Highway,
is.
I think Highway 290.
290 that connects Dripping Springs to Austin.
Yes.
You know, it's not enough to say that the construction of that highway enabled, and of course this is west of Austin. So this is,
Yeah.
you know, you want to be talking about the fact that the whiteness of this community is not just the fact that it's a suburb, right? And it's a reflection of this, it's a suburb of the western part of Austin. But then look, really interesting, you've got this cluster of Hispanics here. What is this? Do you know? Is that,
I know there's
it might
like,
be public housing?
yeah, there's one street. It's really weird, but I don't know if this is coincidental or not, but there's one street, I forgot what it's called, in Dripping Springs, and it's like where a lot of the Hispanic community lives. And then surrounding that would be like neighborhoods. It's a shortcut street. Sorry, I'm blanking on the name. But it's just really interesting how the Hispanics are clustered on that one street, because that's really how it is whenever driving by, like, and I've lived there my whole life, so I kind of noticed that.
This is Adam. I was wondering, can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
I was wondering, maybe in Dripping Springs, I mean, the people out there have a lot of wealth and land, you know, so maybe you can just look at how spatially the accumulation of land that one owner has compared to that cluster of neighborhoods that multiple families and households have, limited space to. Does that make sense?
And what you can see that I'm doing here, I don't know if it's going to work right now, but I often use Google, not even Google Earth, but you know when you can get like the Google view, a view of streets, Google Maps, to sort of find out what's there, right? So if Dana, if this was my project, I see this cluster of Hispanics here, and maybe like Adam is saying, this might be apartment complexes, right? And it just so happens to be that people with low incomes happen to be disproportionately Latino. So why is that, right? So, and then there's also like this interesting cluster of white folks here. I don't know if that's a subdivision or whatever it is, but the idea, folks, is that when you're coming down to this argument that, oh, there's a concentration of minorities here because they don't have as much money, you have to go back to Rothstein and make the argument that the intergenerational transfer of wealth is racialized in important ways, right? It's not just, it can't just be an explanation that white people have money, therefore they can live by the golf course. You have to sort of dig deeper and explain that this inequality in wealth is a reflection of past practices of racial segregation and racism elsewhere, right? You know, other students of mine have done things like studied Huntsville, Texas, and sometimes it's really sad, but maybe some of you, when you see these things like this, when you see densely populated communities of color, oftentimes it's public housing, other times it might actually be prisons. And a lot of rural communities, I think it was Mitchell in his forums, was talking about, you know, the privatization of industry of jails and the proliferation of jails in our country, in part to the war on drugs. And so a lot of rural communities make money by housing prisoners from urban areas. And you might be seeing some of that in the landscape. So it's not enough just to say, oh, you know, this was once part of Mexico or the 1920s revolution or whatever. You have to be able to say they're living in this area because here is, you know, this is the bad part of town and the housing is cheaper, or there was a new subdivision built over here and houses start at $200,000 a year, right? Which prices out many people who might be immigrants or haven't benefited from the accumulation of wealth like white communities have. So it's not enough just to say the dynamic that brought that group. You have to explain why that group is in a particular spot in the landscape. Anybody doing the southern border?
I'm not doing the southern border in particularly. I'm doing Southwest Houston, where there's like a large concentration of Latino immigrants. And I was wondering if I could use like outside factors, like in the 1980s, the political tension in Latin America that brought a huge migration, and then like the IRCA as well.
Yeah.
Wondering if I could use like anything that didn't happen in the United States.
Most definitely. Yeah. I mean, for example, the Mexican Revolution of the 1920s that brought a lot of people, a lot of Mexican nationals to the United States. You know, I think like some of the Hispanic, the little Mexico neighborhoods in Austin, as they were called, that they were established during the Mexican Revolution. And that would be an example of a non-US based factor. So most definitely. So is that the Sugar Land area?
No, it's well, it kind of extends towards Sugar Land, because Sugar Land is part of Southwest. But if you go more towards the city, towards downtown, there's a concentration of just Hispanics, because usually the concentration of Hispanics in Houston is in the northern area. But there's like a small concentration, and that's where I grew up. And it's like, if you notice, it's like the main road is Bissonnette, and if you go down Bissonnette, it extends into Bel Air, and then just huge houses with people of upper class, and it's majority white. And so that's what I was gonna use. I was gonna use like the Hispanic population. I was gonna use Bissonnette as like the main like road where like once you like go on Bissonnette, it's just Hispanics, well, huge concentration of Hispanics, and then once you hit Bel Air, it's just all white.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And of course, with Houston, you might want to be thinking about the history of the wards. And, you know, for example, that all white area, Bel Air, is that what you said it's called?
Yes.
It historically might have been a white only neighborhood. And of course, you know, Houston was redlined. And I know that the redlining of Houston, it combines in complex ways with that history of the creation of Negro neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Houston's really complex because the ward system was a system of racial segregation, but Hispanics have always been in sort of a weird position in relationship to Jim Crow. But there certainly would have been racial segregation practices against Hispanics, but it can be a little bit harder to find evidence of that. And that's when you go and you ask grandma or you ask your parents
So I
to
have a
help you
question.
with part of that history.
So I actually interviewed my parents and like a bunch of their friends who used to live there. How could I include that into my paper?
You just cite it as a personal interview,
Mhm.
and then yeah. Let me see if I can get an example here.
For those of y'all that are interviewing people, what are y'all like asking them? Because I wanted to interview people, but I'm not sure exactly what to ask.